My grandson stood in a courtroom packed with strangers, pointed at me beneath the state seal and the flag, and called me a fraud. My name is Dolores Wynn, 76, a retired accountant from a Detroit auto plant. I spent 4 decades with shoes under my desk and grease in the air, counting inventory and wages until the numbers balanced. I am a woman who made a life out of bullshitting. I am a woman who believed that paper tells the truth. Ryan Wynn, 25. My grandson, and a law clerk who wears a suit one size too eager for his age, raised a binder thick as a phone book. He said the binder proved that I had turned family money and factory kickbacks into a chain of properties. He said I had laundered our name. His voice didn't tremble. He moved his jaw the way his father does when he thinks he is about to win. People turned to look at me the way you look at a purse left unguarded. Daniel Wynn, my son, sat behind him at the plaintiff's table. He is a man who tried businesses that never quite existed, a man who writes goals on whiteboards and leaves them there when the markers dry out. He had taught Ryan to nod at judges, to keep sentences measured. Melissa Wynn, my daughter-in-law, sat with her legs crossed, hands quiet on her lap. She has a voice that sounds helpful even when it is cutting. It was the first time I had seen them together in weeks. No one looked at me. The clerk read the case caption, Wynn versus Wynn, and the judge asked for an opening. The judge was a woman with a gray bun, and a reputation for liking neat facts more than loud feelings. I thought that should have helped me. Neat facts are a language I can speak. Still, the word that hung in the room came from the boy I had taken fishing when he was 9. Fraud, he said again, this time as if it were my given name. He lifted a page with red tabs and red addresses, and even the addresses sounded like accusations. He read Cortlandt Street, he read a bungalow on Gratiot, he read a duplex no one looked at twice until I fixed the roof. He said they were 17. He said I had hidden them. He said the houses came from a slush fund at the plant, a stash, skimmed off overtime that never reached the line workers. He explained that the ledger entries matched my handwriting. He explained that I had signed off on the movement of funds to a name that belonged to no department. The court reporter typed with a steady rhythm. The bailiff scratched a note on the side of his palm. A local blogger hovered by the back bench. She smelled a story. My mouth tasted like pennies. I folded my hands and kept my posture straight. My wrists remembered the weight of time cards. My eyes stayed on the judge. When I looked at Ryan, I did not see the baby who ate peaches on my porch, or the boy whose sneakers I dried over my registers when he ran through rain. I saw a young man who had practiced this moment in a mirror. He had underlined the word fraud on his notes in blue pen. He had not underlined the word grandmother anywhere. He told the judge that a woman who spent a lifetime at a plant knew where the seams were. He said a woman who learned pay codes could route money. He said a woman who always kept receipts could keep the wrong ones. He said that after my husband died, I had taken what wasn't mine and wrapped it in paper. Melissa leaned forward with a tidy smile and passed a printed spreadsheet to the bailiff for the judge. In the first row, I recognized the name of a vendor I had used for 30 years, a man who sold us bolts and swept his own floor. In the second row, I recognized the ghost of my own signature, but it sat on a line where my hand had never rested. They had cut my name from a donation check. I wrote to a library drive in 2002 and pasted it onto a purchase order for parts that were never delivered. The letters of my name had jagged edges where they once were smooth. I saw it at a glance because that is what my life trained me to see. That Daniel did not look at me. He adjusted his tie and stared at the judge the way men stare at a house they want to flip. He had the stance of someone who told himself a story and then built a porch on it. The judge turned a page and then another. She asked for a summary of assets. Ryan said there were 17 properties, all titled to me. He said that each deed corresponded with periods when questionable entries appeared in the plant accounts. He said the pattern was obvious to anyone who wanted to see. He said it as if the word obvious could engineer a past. The courtroom had the smell of wood polish and coffee, and behind the judge, the flag did not move. I kept my face still. When you worked on the books for people who built engines, you learned to do your work without theater. In that plant there were sirens sometimes, and once there was a fire, and in the dark weeks of recession there were layoffs, and in all of it, my job was to be the person who counted correctly while the world shook. That is what I did again. I counted breath, counted heartbeats, counted the places where the people I love had placed their bets against me. The judge asked if the plaintiff had an initial exhibit. Ryan pushed the binder to the front and requested that the court accept copies of ledgers. He explained that the family believed the properties had been purchased using money diverted from a special account meant to cushion workers during a strike. He said strike fund, and a murmur passed through the benches. Even lies are heavy when they attach themselves to worker pride. He told the judge that our family had tried to address this privately, that I had refused to explain, that he had come to the court not for revenge but for accountability. He had learned that word in his first semester at law school, and he liked the way it sounded when applied to other people. He said he loved me. He said that was why he had to do this. He looked at the back of the room, where a camera phone glowed. He knew how to speak to a room beyond the room. I did not rise to object. My attorney touched my forearm, but I did not move. The facts would crawl in on their own feet if given space. Numbers know the way. That is the only faith I ever kept. Now the judge did what the title of this story promised. She asked for a list of assets in my name. The clerk began to read them, one by one. The sound of each address carried like a nail struck true. She read the duplex on Crooks Road, the cottage on a street where maples cracked sidewalks, the narrow house I bought from a widow who had cried into a dish towel and told me she could not mow anymore. She read all 17. The courtroom settled into a hush that was almost a verdict, but not the kind my family wanted. You could hear in the silence that the number itself was a fact, and facts are stubborn. What they meant was still up for carving. As the clerk read, Daniel's eyes sharpened the way an appraiser's do when he realizes there is a second lot behind the house. Melissa's fingers tapped a pattern against her knee, so faint it could have been a prayer. Ryan kept his chin lifted, and I watched him listen to the arithmetic of my life. 17 is not a giant number in real estate. It is a giant number in a kitchen. It is the count of something you did on purpose for years. I rolled a key between my fingers under the table. It was the key to the first house, a little square with a porch where the railing had come loose. I had bought it with cash earned taking on overtime reconciliations no one else wanted. Those late-night sessions where I hunted pennies that went missing in payroll because someone misread a 1 for a 7. I kept the key on my ring for luck. It wasn't special metal. It was a promise I made to myself when Detroit wasn't anyone's promise anymore. I did not raise the key. I didn't need to. It left a crescent in my skin. The judge asked me if I understood the accusations. I said that I did. I did not give a speech. I said my name for the record, and my age, and that I had worked as an accountant at Gilroy Motors from 1974 until the day the plant cut us loose. I said that I owned the properties in my name because I paid for them. I let the quiet after that sentence carry its own weight. People expect a woman my age to ramble. They think if you give her rope, she will talk herself into trouble. I have spent too long with balance sheets to spend words that do not return. When we broke for a short recess, Daniel turned toward me as if to ask whether I remembered the beach we used to drive to on Lake St. Clair, whether I recalled the lunches I packed for him when his father worked double shifts, whether I wanted to make a deal. But he did not ask. He looked over my shoulder instead, to the blogger, to the people with open apps, to the possibility that he was a heroic son. His hand brushed the shoulder of Ryan's suit jacket. Melissa adjusted the papers so that the first page with my name on it winked at her like a mirror. A reporter with a scarf around her neck met me at the hallway's edge and asked if I had anything to say to the community. I said the community knows my porch light. I said the community knows that I show up with a rake when the alley floods. She smiled the way people do when they think you have dodged their question. She did not know that the answer was there in the sentence and not in the glitter of it, in the hallway. There was a corkboard with flyers for adoption fairs and food banks and yoga in the basement of a church. A volunteer in a red vest offered me a styrofoam cup of water and did not recognize me as a character. She recognized me as a woman with white hair, a cardigan, and shoes that were kind to her arches. She said court days were long. I said factory shifts were longer. We both smiled like Michigan women do when the talk of weather would only insult the weather. A bailiff called us back. Melissa avoided stepping on a scuff mark in the tile. Ryan tightened his tie. A young man I did not know held the door for me. He looked at my face and then at my hands, perhaps expecting shaking. There was none. I have added long columns of numbers, with sirens wailing, with foremen shouting, with men crying in offices when entire departments were told to go home. This was noise. I knew how to listen past it. Back inside, my attorney asked to reserve our response for later parts of the proceedings. The judge agreed. She told the room that a list of 17 deeds in one woman's name was not itself evidence of wrongdoing. She said the day would be long, and the roads outside were slick, so everyone should choose their steps carefully. Her mouth tilted slightly at that. A line you might miss unless your life included the habit of reading expressions the way you read margins. Ryan explained that he would next tie specific deposits to dates when the properties were acquired. He mentioned a ledger I kept in a kitchen drawer where I recorded rent collected in pencil because ink bled on grease days. He said the family would demonstrate that the ledger corresponded with phantom invoices. He did not know yet that he would have to prove the phantom. He was still a boy at the edge of a lake, throwing stones to make circles. Daniel sent a message on his phone and then slid it into his pocket, with a movement too fast for the bench to see and too familiar for me to miss. Melissa reached for Ryan's elbow, she whispered. He nodded. It was coordination, the way men lifting a heavy appliance count together to make the turn. The clerk read the last of the addresses and put the sheet down. In the moment after, I watched something pass across the room that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with arithmetic. The room had measured the number and found it large. People who came expecting a cartoon now saw a ledger. You could almost feel them hold my houses in their heads like coins, and then set them down again one by one, thinking about roofs and taxes and years. That is the kind of thought that takes seconds and changes futures. The judge asked if I had anything I wanted to add for now. I said that I would ask the court to note that I kept every receipt for every nail, every lock, every furnace check, because it is what a woman like me does. I said I would present them when asked. I did not smile. I placed my hand on my purse, where a manila envelope waited, corner sharp against my knuckles. I did not open it. I only let the envelope's presence join the record like a quiet witness. When the gavel touched wood, the sound was small and final. The people stood. The flag did not move. My grandson stepped aside so the aisle could clear and then reached for a chair, as if to steady himself. Daniel put a firm palm between his son's shoulder blades and pushed him forward into the corridor of eyes. Melissa turned her face to avoid mine and checked the time. The hallway filled with shoes and perfume and the thick, tired air of people who had spent an hour believing they understood a stranger. I walked past the reporter and past the corkboard and past a sign that told us to silence our phones. I kept my keys in my hand. In the glass of a display case full of little awards for civic cleanliness, I saw my reflection. It looked like a woman whose life had been made of stacks of paper and walked floors and nights on porches waiting for tenants to come home safe. It looked like someone people had decided to rename. Out in the January light, the wind pressed at my coat, and the courthouse steps pitched slightly under salt. I took the steps with the same care I took across slick factory floors. A man in a tiger's cap held the door and said that his aunt used to rent from me on Cortlandt, and he had never had a landlord come change a light bulb on a Sunday morning, but I had. He did not have a camera. He did not ask for a quote. He said, "Good luck," like it was a small prayer, and kept going. I stood under the flag snapping on the pole and counted to 17. I did not count houses. I counted years of choosing to be up before daylight, of driving nails, of carrying paint cans when my wrists were strong and then when they were not. Numbers are not cold. They keep the heat of the hands that earned them. Inside the courtroom, my grandson was rehearsing another sentence. Inside my purse, the manila envelope pressed against the fabric. The day was only beginning. The second morning of testimony opened with a shuffle of papers that did not belong to me. Daniel Wynn, my eldest son, walked to the witness stand, carrying a folder, wrapped in the smugness of someone who believed ink could substitute for blood. The judge asked him to state his name, and he did so with the confidence of a man introducing himself at a business luncheon, rather than in a courtroom where his mother sat accused. He said he had documents that proved I had siphoned money from the factory during my years of work. The bailiff handed the folder to the bench. The judge slipped on her glasses. In the silence, you could hear a clock somewhere in the hall ticking. Daniel spoke about the quirk of my handwriting, the loops I placed on capital letters, the way my numbers slanted left when I wrote quickly. He said those quirks matched the signatures on authorizations for funds that never reached their intended departments. He said the money flowed instead into private accounts that later lined up with the dates of my property purchases. He said it with the flat authority of a man who thought the shape of his words would make them true. I recognized the pages. They were records from the late 80s, when the plant teetered through layoffs and the books carried more red than black. I remembered those nights of overtime, my desk stacked with invoices, my body sore from sitting too long on a chair meant for younger spines. I remembered fighting for accuracy because one misplaced digit could decide whether a man's paycheck fed his family or bounced back. Now, those same pages sat under fluorescent light, used to paint me as a thief. The prosecutor asked Daniel how he obtained them. He said he found them in storage boxes when helping me clean out the basement. He said I had kept them hidden for decades. He told the court I had said the words, "Some things are better left unseen." My throat tightened, not from guilt but from the certainty that I had never uttered that phrase in my life. He had written dialogue for me, and now the court transcribed it as if it had lived in my mouth. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Wynne, do these signatures look like yours?" she asked. I leaned forward, studied the pages, and nodded. "Yes, the loops are mine," I said, "but the context is not. Those signatures were attached to routine reconciliations, not to ghost accounts. My name has been lifted and glued to numbers that don't belong." I offered no more because I knew the judge wanted brevity, not defense speeches. Daniel glanced at Ryan, who sat upright, pen in hand, every movement rehearsed. My grandson gave him a quick nod, the gesture of a soldier to a commander. Melissa sat further back, her smile faint, her eyes steady on me, as if measuring my collapse in real time. The moral weight of the moment pressed hardest when the prosecutor asked Daniel why he chose to testify against his own mother. His answer came quick, polished, "Because the truth that matters more than family comfort," he said, "because workers at the plant deserved better, because no one should be above accountability." He addressed betrayal in the costume of virtue. People in the gallery murmured, impressed by his righteousness. I sat with my palms flat, absorbing the sting. The judge called a recess. As we shuffled into the hallway, a man from the neighborhood approached me. He wore a delivery uniform, his cap frayed at the edges. He said, not loudly but enough for others to hear, "If even a son points at his mother, maybe the rest of us shouldn't have trusted her either." His words sliced deeper than any exhibit. That was the moral moment I had feared, a stranger taking my child's accusation as final proof. I wanted to tell him about decades of balanced books, about checks double-counted to protect men like him. I said nothing. Silence is sometimes the only dignity left. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor pressed the point that my own son had testified against me, that family loyalty had cracked because guilt was too obvious to ignore. She asked the judge to consider how rarely children take such a step unless evidence compels them. My attorney objected, but the words lingered. People love a story where righteousness triumphs over blood. They forget that righteousness can be staged. Daniel returned to his seat. He avoided my eyes but straightened his shoulders as if he had done something noble. Ryan patted his arm in approval. Melissa whispered to them both, her lips curving as though victory was already sealed. I sat alone, the space around me widening. The distance between benches became a canyon. The judge announced that the ledgers would be admitted as preliminary exhibits pending verification. The sound of her gavel carried finality, and I felt the weight of isolation press harder. These were not strangers doubting me anymore. These were people who carried my name, turning documents into knives. As the session closed, I gathered my coat. In the corridor, a young woman with a notepad asked if I wanted to comment on my son's testimony. Her pen hovered, ready to record something quotable. I looked her in the eye and said, "Paper lies when men make it lie. Numbers can be bent, but they remember the hands that bent them." She blinked, scribbled, and I walked away before she could ask more. That line became the ripple I had not intended. By evening, local blogs quoted it as a cryptic defense. Some readers mocked, others wondered. It traveled further than I had imagined, because truth spoken under fire has a way of echoing. That was the moment that spread an old woman accused, refusing to fold her language into apology. I returned home to an empty kitchen. The ledgers that remained in my drawer stared back at me, harmless until placed in hostile hands. I set my keys on the counter, counted them once, and pressed my palms against the cool surface. My son's voice still rang in my ears, declaring that duty mattered more than family. My grandson's echo carried it forward. The sting was not only that they had turned against me, but that they believed their performance was justice. Night settled, heavy over Detroit. I looked out at the street where one of my houses stood dark, its windows boarded while waiting for repair. 17 roofs bore my effort, but one courtroom word threatened to strip them of honor. The day had shown me that betrayal wears fine clothes, carries folders, and speaks the language of virtue. Tomorrow would demand more of me than silence. On the third day the case turned colder, sharper. I watched as Melissa Wynne, my daughter-in-law, rose from her seat with a folder tucked against her side as if she were carrying proof of God himself. She walked toward the bench with a smile too, even for the occasion, the kind of smile that wins over neighbors but hides teeth. She asked permission to submit personal ledgers discovered in my home. Notes she claimed revealed the machinery behind my so-called empire of properties. The judge gestured for the bailiff to collect them. Pages rustled under the fluorescent lights. On the top sheet I recognized my own handwriting immediately. Grocery lists, notes about furnace repairs, a reminder to replace a leaky gutter. It was a housewife's shorthand, written in pencil between shifts, nothing more. Melissa's voice cut through the room, clear and confident. She told the court these were not household notes but disguised records of transactions, coded tallies, of illicit funds. She pointed to the word milk, and argued it was a stand-in for mortgage payments. She pointed to paint and claimed it represented contractor fees. She leaned on my scribbles, as though they were ciphers. Ryan sat upright, nodding along, his pen poised like a sword. He looked as if he believed every syllable. Daniel pressed a hand on his son's shoulder, proud. The gallery leaned forward. To them, it must have sounded like revelation. A secret code cracked open. To me, it was madness made credible by the calm of her delivery. Melissa explained how each line in the notebook aligned with dates of deed filings. She said, I had used the appearance of mundane expenses to camouflage an underground ledger. She said it was a deliberate system, proof of long-standing intent to defraud. Her voice never wavered. She laid the papers out one by one across the rail like cards in a magician's trick. The judge asked me if I recognized the writings. I admitted they were mine. I said they were notes any woman might keep, reminders to stretch dollars, to manage a household on less than people assumed. I said if she saw codes in them, it was because she came looking for them. The judge raised a brow, not persuaded, not dismissive. She ordered the pages entered as exhibits, pending analysis. Melissa smiled again, but this time her eyes fixed on me, cold and certain. I knew then she had prepared this for months, digging through my things not to understand me but to destroy me. She had combed through drawers where I kept pencils worn to nubs, circled words until they suited her story. She had turned the evidence of thrift into evidence of crime. In the hallway during recess, a woman from the neighborhood touched my sleeve. She whispered, I keep notebooks just like yours. Should I burn them? Her eyes searched mine for comfort. I wanted to reassure her, but the reporters hovered, pens out, recording even my silence. I only told her to keep her papers close. She walked away unsettled, and I knew the seed of doubt had been planted beyond the courtroom. That was Melissa's true skill, poisoning the well of trust so that every ordinary act looked suspect. When the court reconvened, Melissa pressed further. She recited entries aloud, her tone mocking. Eggs, bread, utilities, she read, then paused for effect. These align perfectly with deposit slips we obtained from the bank. She held up photocopies with highlights in neon. The spectators muttered. My own words, once private, had become a stage prop. The prosecutor asked her to explain motive. Melissa said I had lived in the shadows of industry men, that I had resented their salaries, and that I had found my own way to wealth. She said secrecy was my power, that I built a wall of silence and coded ledgers to hide behind. Her narrative painted me greedy, cunning, deceptive. Every glance at me from the benches carried judgment. I kept my face steady, though inside I measured the distance between fact and fiction. I knew those notebooks held no hidden key. But the crowd saw smoke and assumed fire. Even the judge leaned closer to the papers, lips pursed. Numbers had been my defense all my life. Now they were twisted into accusations that spread like cracks through glass. After the session ended, Daniel approached me near the courthouse steps. His voice was low, urgent. You could stop this if you'd just admit what you did, he said. His eyes darted to passing reporters. He wanted my surrender, not for truth, but for headlines. I told him he knew better, and he turned away as if my denial were an insult. Melissa pulled him back by the arm, whispering something sharp. They walked off together, leaving me in the cold. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the place where those notebooks had once rested without menace. I remembered writing down sugar after a long day, planning pies for Christmas. I remembered jotting roof patch, the week rain leaked into the bedroom. These were pieces of a life lived carefully, modestly, with attention to every penny. Now, those same words were rebranded as code. I understood then that the fight ahead was not only about deeds and dollars, but about reclaiming the language of my own life from people who had twisted it to serve their hunger. I closed my eyes, exhaled, and pressed my hands against the cool wood of the table. Tomorrow would bring more exhibits, more accusations, but tonight I reminded myself, numbers can lie when placed in the wrong hands, yet they also remember the truth. I would need to show the court whose hands they truly came from. The first headlines landed the same week the neighborhood association held its monthly meeting. A local paper ran a column titled, "Retired Accountant Accused of Cheating Workers." By then, the courthouse whispers had leaked, twisted into sharper accusations. The article quoted unnamed sources familiar with the case who claimed I siphoned money from the strike fund at the plant and turned it into personal real estate. No reporter had asked me for comment. My picture cropped from a church picnic 2 summers back sat beside the story. I saw it on a neighbor's porch before I even received my own copy. That night, when I stepped into the recreation hall where the homeowners association met, silence rippled across the folding chairs. Usually those evenings were filled with chatter about potholes, lawns, and parking rules. This time Mr. Harlow, a man who prided himself on knowing every ordinance by number, cleared his throat and called the room to order with a stiffness that belonged in court more than in a community meeting. He was the kind of neighbor who could recite square footage requirements without looking at notes, a stickler for order. I had sparred with him before about fence heights and snow shoveling, but this time his eyes avoided mine until he had no choice. "Mrs. Wynne," he said, "there are concerns about the reputation of our neighborhood. Reports suggest that some of the properties on your portfolio were acquired through questionable means. The community deserves transparency." His words landed like stones. He was not asking, he was accusing in front of 50 faces I had known for decades. A woman from 2 streets over whispered to the person beside her, loud enough for me to hear, "If even her grandson took her to court, there must be truth." Another man muttered about tenants complaining of unfair rent hikes, though he had never rented from me. Speculation bloomed like mold. People I had shared barbecues and funerals with looked at me as if I had worn a mask all along. I stood slowly, letting the chair scrape against the linoleum. I told them the case was still ongoing, that no court had reached a verdict. I reminded them that each of my houses had been purchased legally, inspected, taxed, and maintained. Spoke evenly, the way I had spoken in budget meetings at the factory. Numbers do not need emotion to stand upright, but the faces around me hardened. Mr. Harlow tapped his gavel, a gesture more theatrical than official, and announced the board would investigate whether my ownership posed a liability to the association. The word liability rolled through the room like a verdict already sealed. For the first time in my life, I felt the ground shift under me, not because of law or ledger, but because of perception. After the meeting, a reporter cornered me in the parking lot. She asked whether I felt guilty exploiting workers to enrich myself. The question was framed like fact. I told her I felt guilty only that gossip had replaced truth in the mouths of people I trusted. She scribbled anyway, eager for copy. When her piece appeared online the next day, the headline read, "Elderly Landlord Dodges Question of Exploitation." They had stripped my words to make room for their narrative. The next Sunday at church, eyes followed me down the aisle. Pastor Graham still shook my hand, but his grip felt careful, as though distance might protect him if my name turned toxic. Neighbors who once asked me for advice about taxes now lowered their voices when I approached. Even children, picking up their parents' unease, glanced at me differently. Back in court, the prosecutor seized on the growing public doubt. She read excerpts from the newspaper aloud, asking the judge to note how community trust had eroded. My attorney objected, but the damage was done. Words printed in ink carried weight, even if they were built on whispers. Ryan sat proud, as if the echo outside the courtroom validated his accusations inside it. Daniel adjusted his tie with smug composure. Melissa leaned back, satisfied, her hands folded neatly on her lap. For me, the harshest blow was not the courtroom maneuvering, but the realization that decades of honesty could be undone in weeks by the mouths of family and the eagerness of a community to believe the worst. In the plant, I had spent nights fighting to make sure every paycheck matched the hours worked. Those same workers might now read headlines and assume I had stolen from them. That betrayal cut deeper than any legal claim. One evening, I walked past the duplex on Cortlandt, the first property I had bought. A tenant's child waved to me, smiling wide. His mother, standing in the doorway, hesitated before raising her hand in greeting. The pause was enough. She had read the stories too. I could feel the shift in how she saw me, not as the landlord who fixed her leaking sink on a Saturday, but as the woman in the newspaper accused of betrayal. I held my chin steady. I reminded myself that lies travel fast, but truth has legs that last longer. Yet the isolation pressed heavy. My own street, once friendly, now felt lined with jurors. Even the sound of Mr. Harlow's gavel from that meeting echoed in my head at night. Fraud, liability, reputation, words, weaponized not by strangers, but by people who had eaten at my table. When court resumed the next morning, the judge acknowledged the public noise but reminded everyone that evidence, not rumor, would guide her verdict. Still, I noticed how she lingered on the exhibits a little longer, as if aware of the storm outside. The community's judgment had seeped into the walls of justice itself. I sat silently, letting my accusers talk, their voices weaving tales that drew nods from the benches. I gripped the armrest and kept my gaze forward. I had survived recessions, layoffs, the collapse of a city once mighty with steel and rubber. I could survive this too. But I understood now. The battle was not only for my properties, not only for my freedom, it was for my name, for the thin line between trust and ruin in the eyes of everyone who thought they knew me. When the fifth session began, I thought the prosecution had already emptied their bag. They had paraded notebooks, clipped signatures, headlines, and neighborhood gossip. Yet that morning, the air was thicker, as if they had saved a knife meant to reach deeper. The prosecutor called a witness, and when the name echoed through the chamber, I felt my chest pull tight. Pastor Graham walked to the stand. His black suit looked pressed with care, his Bible tucked under his arm as if moral weight had its own gravity. I had known him for decades. He had baptized children in this very family, had spoken words of comfort when my husband was buried. To see him, seated as a witness against me, made the floor tilt. He raised his hand, swore to tell the truth, then settled into the chair. The prosecutor asked about my financial dealings years ago. He shifted uncomfortably, then told the room about a conversation we had long ago when Daniel was drowning in debts. He said I had signed as guarantor on a loan to help my son, that I had confided in him afterward. He repeated my words or the words as he remembered them, that sometimes bending a rule was the only way to keep family afloat. The courtroom stirred. People leaned forward, hungry for confirmation that even a pastor could tie me to wrongdoing. The prosecutor pressed him. So she admitted to you that she used her position to cover her son's debts? She asked. He hesitated, then said, she told me she signed papers she should not have signed. Ryan's face lit as if he had won his first case outright. Daniel lowered his eyes, not with shame but with calculation. Melissa rested her chin on her hand, serene. They knew this would land heavier than ledgers or scribbled grocery lists. A pastor's testimony carried weight in Detroit's neighborhoods, where faith was as common as factory dust. The judge asked if I wished to respond. I stood, hands steady on the rail, and said only that I had indeed guaranteed my son's loan. Years ago, when banks still lent on the handshake of family loyalty, I said I had never stolen to cover it, that the decision was a mother's act of trust, not a crime. I spoke plainly, not begging sympathy, but stating fact. The judge nodded, but the gallery murmured anyway. To them, a mother's loyalty had just been painted as evidence of complicity. During recess, I found myself cornered in the corridor by a woman clutching a newspaper. She whispered, "If even your pastor says it, maybe it's true." Her doubt weighed heavier than accusation. That was the moral strike, the erosion of credibility, not just in law, but in the hearts of those who once believed in me without question. Back inside, the prosecutor asked the pastor if he thought my actions showed disregard for financial integrity. He looked troubled, eyes darting toward me, then said, "I believe she chose family over principle." The words landed like hammers. Not theft, not embezzlement, something worse for a woman like me. Betrayal of principle. My life's work had been principle. I stayed silent, though fire burned in my chest. The bailiff called order as murmurs swelled again. I watched Ryan whisper to Melissa, saw Daniel's shoulders ease. They thought the walls were closing in. They thought one man's memory had buried me. But I also watched the pastor's hands. They trembled as he set the Bible aside, as though even he knew the truth had been bent, reshaped to fit the narrative placed before him. I filed that detail away, another number to balance later. That when the gavel finally ended the day, I walked out beneath a sky heavy with clouds. Neighbors glanced at me on the courthouse steps, some with pity, some with judgment. The story had shifted again, from financial fraud to moral failure. They weren't just questioning my books anymore. They were questioning my soul. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the old loan documents spread before me. My signature sat there, firm, clean, attached to Daniel's name. A mother's mistake, not a criminal's scheme. I thought of the men at the factory whose wages I had guarded, of the nights I had counted and recounted until my eyes blurred. I thought of how quickly years of truth could be recast by one voice in a pulpit. The pastor had not lied entirely, but he had told half-truths sharpened into blades, and half-truths in a courtroom cut deeper than outright lies. I folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and pressed my palm flat against it. They had used family against me, now faith. I understood the pattern. They would strip every layer of trust I had built until nothing stood between me and their story. But I also understood something else. Once you know the arithmetic of betrayal, you can count its steps forward. They had shown me their hand. They had burned credibility to fuel momentum. And momentum, like any balance sheet, can turn. I closed my eyes, let the silence of the house settle. The next move was not mine to rush, but it would come. By the 6th week of hearings, my name had been dragged through enough mud that even strangers spoke it with suspicion. Each session stacked accusation on accusation, until the weight of rumor pressed heavier than evidence. But on that gray morning, something shifted. The bailiff announced a witness I had not expected. Susan Miller stepped forward, her posture stiff but steady. She had once shared a desk row with me at Gilroy Motors, back when the factory ran 3 shifts and the cafeteria served coffee so strong it peeled paint. We had spent decades together poring over payroll, reconciling overtime slips, chasing down mismatched invoices. Now she carried a worn leather binder, thick as a Bible, clutched close against her chest. The prosecutor's lips tightened. They had not called her. My attorney had. The judge nodded for her to be sworn in. She raised her hand, her voice firm as she pledged the truth. Then she sat, opening the binder with the care of someone handling fragile glass. The first pages she presented were ledgers, faded ink, dated signatures, stamped approvals. She explained to the court that these were her copies from years past. Records she had saved because, in her words, numbers don't lie if you keep them where liars can't touch them. Her voice carried no theatrics, only the certainty of a woman who had balanced more columns than most men had ever read. Ryan leaned forward, his pen scratching furiously, his jaw tight. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing toward Melissa, who masked her reaction with a still face but twitched her fingers against her skirt. They had built their accusations on fragments, altered pages, interpretations bent into weapons. Susan now laid out originals that exposed the cracks. She flipped to one particular year, the late 80s, the same years Daniel had claimed I had siphoned strike funds. Susan pointed out the reconciliations line by line, the signatures intact, the accounts properly closed. There was no slush fund, she told the judge. I was there. She balanced every cent, sometimes at her own expense, staying late until numbers matched. If money had been stolen, I'd have known. The prosecutor tried to undermine her, asking why she had kept the papers so long. Susan explained she had learned never to trust management's archives. Too many times records went missing. She had kept duplicates for her own peace of mind, and in doing so, she had preserved the truth my family sought to erase. Melissa whispered sharply into Daniel's ear. His face flushed, but he said nothing. Ryan scribbled, then froze, realizing the neat story he had constructed did not hold when placed against pages untouched by manipulation. Susan turned to the judge, speaking with a steadiness that cut through the courtroom hum. This woman is accused of fraud. I worked beside her for 30 years. If anything, she was too honest. She'd chase down a nickel era until midnight. She turned down promotions because she wouldn't pad hours for supervisors. These accusations, they're a child's fantasy scribbled over real history. The gallery stirred. Some faces softened, Others frowned in confusion. The current of certainty against me faltered. The gavel struck once for order. As Susan closed her binder, she reached into an envelope and pulled out something more personal, a notebook, worn at the edges, filled with penciled columns. "These are her drafts," she said, "notes she made when reconciling long shifts. She gave them to me when my own eyes grew tired, and I kept them. Look at the handwriting. Compare it to the so-called codes her daughter-in-law submitted. Grocery lists are not ledgers. Numbers scratched on breakroom paper towels are not embezzlement." The judge examined the pages. Slowly, she nodded. "We will enter these as defense exhibits," she said. Melissa's jaw tightened. Daniel drummed his fingers, restless. Ryan's face burned red. Their narrative, crafted carefully, was bleeding holes under the weight of testimony that came not from my lips but from the quiet persistence of someone who had lived the same battles I had. When Susan stepped down, she glanced my way only once. Her eyes said what her words could not in front of cameras: "Hold steady. Truth has memory." During recess, I approached her in the corridor. She touched my arm, whispering, "I couldn't let them erase what we did, what you stood for." Her grip was firm, reassuring. She had nothing to gain, no property to inherit, no legacy to burnish. She simply refused to let lies become the final draft. That evening, local outlets scrambled. One headline read, "Former colleague defends accused accountant with records." The narrative cracked. People who had whispered against me now paused, uncertain. A man outside the courthouse muttered, "Maybe she's not the villain," they said. Inside me, the shift was quieter, but deeper. For weeks I had stood alone, my word against the sharpened tongues of blood and rumor. Susan's testimony reminded me that memory and evidence can still outlast malice. My family had weaponized half-truths. Now truth had found its own weapon, in a box of saved ledgers. As I walked back into the courtroom for the next session, I carried not just the sting of betrayal but the faint hum of vindication. The fight was far from finished, but for the first time since Ryan pointed at me and called me a fraud, I saw their certainty tremble. The courtroom carried a different charge on the morning the bank records were brought in. I had grown used to the rhythm of accusation, the familiar cycle of whispers, exhibits, and sidelong looks. But that day, the bailiff called a new name, and the sound of it cut through the air like a fresh blade. Ethan Brooks. He walked with the calm of a man used to ledgers heavier than opinions, a bank officer tasked with confirming the trail of money. He placed a stack of documents on the stand, thick with stamped pages and notarized seals. His suit was plain, his tone even, but every word promised weight. He had no ties to me or to my family, no history to cloud his testimony. He was the kind of witness who could turn suspicion into fact or unravel a case built on sand. The prosecutor began with confidence, asking him to verify accounts linked to my name. Ethan explained that the bank had examined transactions spanning 3 decades, tracing deposits, withdrawals, and mortgage records. At first, his words seemed to lean their way. 17 properties held in my name, each purchased with precision. He acknowledged the volume, the scope. Ryan straightened, proud. Melissa folded her arms, waiting for the hammer to fall. Then Ethan turned a page. His voice stayed calm, but the content shifted. He said the records showed no evidence of embezzled funds. Each purchase had been tied to legitimate savings, pensions, or income from rentals. Taxes had been filed on time, payments cleared, audits passed. He spoke like an engineer describing the stability of a bridge. He said nothing pointed to fraud. A murmur moved through the gallery. Ryan's pen froze mid-word. Daniel clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening on the edge of the table. Melissa's smile thinned. The prosecutor pressed harder, asking about inconsistencies, anything unusual. Ethan nodded once. "There are irregularities," he said, "but not where the plaintiff suggests." He pulled forward a series of documents, highlighting signatures on loan applications filed in my name. The handwriting bore my loops and slants, but the strokes faltered uneven. The applications requested loans I had never taken, for sums I had never seen. They had been secured against properties I already owned outright. The payments had gone into accounts not tied to me at all. Deafy explained further. Someone had used my identity to leverage debt that never touched my hands. The forgeries were meticulous but imperfect. They bore my name, my social security number, but the addresses for correspondence led elsewhere. Ethan detailed how the bank had flagged these accounts after routine audits, how the paper trail bent toward recent years rather than decades past. The judge leaned forward, attentive. The prosecutor stumbled, trying to regain footing, asking whether it was possible I had authorized someone else to act on my behalf. Ethan shook his head firmly. Not without notarized power of attorney, and none exists. These documents are fraudulent, and the fraud is not Mrs. Wynn's. Silence filled the courtroom, heavy and sharp. The gavel struck once for order, as voices swelled. My heart beat steady in my chest. For weeks I had endured accusation, layered on accusation, each one slicing away at my name. Now, for the first time, truth cut back. Ryan's face flushed, his eyes darting toward his father. Daniel avoided looking at him, staring instead at the table, as if the grain of wood might swallow him. Melissa tapped her nails once, then stilled her hands completely. Ethan continued, presenting photocopies of withdrawal slips tied to one of Daniel's shell businesses, signed with my forged name. He explained how the funds from these false loans had been funneled into ventures that collapsed, leaving debt behind. The liability, he said, belonged not to me but to whoever filed those fraudulent applications. The judge asked him directly, "Are you testifying that Mrs. Wynn's holdings are legitimate?" Ethan answered without hesitation, "Yes, every deed, every tax filing, every mortgage payment aligns. The only fraud here is the forgery committed in her name." Gasps rippled through the benches. A woman in the back whispered, "Then she didn't steal anything." Another man muttered about sons and greed. The tide in the room shifted, if only slightly. The prosecutor tried to recover, questioning Ethan about motive. He replied with precision, "The motive is evident. Properties carry value. Debt concealed in another's name buys time. It is common in cases of familial exploitation." He did not look toward my family as he said it, but the weight of his words dragged their faces into the light anyway. I sat, still, my hands folded, my shoulders square. Inside me, a small spark glowed. Not triumph yet, but recognition. Paper can be bent, signatures can be forged, but numbers when traced carefully always reveal their true path. When court recessed, the hall buzzed with voices. Reporters crowded, asking if I felt vindicated. I told them only, "Truth has its own accountant." That line spread before the afternoon was over, printed in bold as if it were scripture. Daniel did not approach me. He walked quickly past, eyes fixed on the ground. Melissa held Ryan by the elbow, whispering fiercely as they vanished through the doors. Their performance had cracked. That evening, I sat with the photocopies Ethan had handed my attorney. Black and white proofs of forged loans, dates circled in red. My own name bent to purposes I had never chosen. I traced the edges with my finger. Steady. These were not only documents, they were mirrors held to betrayal. The fight was not finished, but the tide had turned. For the first time since my grandson called me a fraud before a judge, the evidence no longer danced to their tune. It stood on my side, steady, unyielding. By the 8th session, the courtroom no longer buzzed with curiosity, it vibrated with tension. The banker had laid out forgery, and for the first time, the balance tilted. Still, Daniel and Ryan clung to their case like drowning men to driftwood. That morning, though, the true architect of the storm finally revealed herself. Melissa stood, not waiting for the prosecutor's cue. She requested permission to address the court, claiming she had critical evidence. Her voice carried a strange composure, not defensive but almost triumphant. She unfolded a packet of documents and slid them toward the bailiff. The judge raised an eyebrow but allowed it. The first page was a memorandum of understanding, a contract between her and a development firm based downtown. Bold letters spelled out the intent: acquisition of distressed properties in bulk for redevelopment. The contract listed addresses that matched mine. Her name was there in ink, alongside signatures of corporate officers. The room froze as the pieces aligned. Melissa admitted she had worked with the company for months. She claimed she had approached them believing my properties were tainted, certain they would soon fall under seizure once fraud was proven. She had positioned herself as the family representative, ready to negotiate sales. She had promised expedited transfers at below market value, arguing that family scandal would depress prices. Reporters in the gallery nearly leaped from their seats, their pens flew. The prosecutor's face paled, realizing control of the narrative had slipped. Melissa went further. She admitted she had supplied the development firm with my household notebooks, with photocopied ledgers, with every scrap of paper that could be spun into suspicion. She had fed the fire, stoking headlines that softened the market. She claimed it was strategic, that she believed she was protecting the family's legacy by converting the properties before legal ruin consumed them. Daniel's head dropped into his hands. Ryan's lips parted in disbelief. He had fought believing his mother's case, but Melissa had fought with calculation, not conviction. He looked betrayed, but he did not withdraw. The judge asked her bluntly, "Are you saying this litigation was leveraged to manipulate property values?" Melissa lifted her chin. "I am saying I acted in anticipation of an inevitable outcome. If she had been found guilty, those properties would have been lost. I sought to salvage what I could." Her words tasted like poison in the air. The courtroom erupted with noise, the gavel striking again and again to restore order. I sat still, every bone in my body resisting the urge to react. Anger would have given her theater. Instead, I let the silence around me do the speaking. People in the benches whispered. So it was about money all along. The gallery's perception shifted not toward me, but toward her. My attorney asked for cross-examination. Melissa's calm began to fray. Questions about her ties to the development firm drew sharp answers. Dates on her emails overlapped perfectly with the weeks she had supposedly discovered incriminating documents against me. The supposed evidence was not stumbled upon but manufactured, coordinated with outside investors. She had not been defending family. She had been paving her own path to profit. Ethan Brooks, still present as an expert, confirmed that several of the forged loan documents Daniel had used to bolster his case-matched files Melissa had transmitted electronically. The handwriting imitations were clumsy, but the metadata was undeniable. The bank traced upload dates, IP addresses, timestamps. Her fingerprints were digital, but clear. Melissa's mask cracked. She snapped at Ethan, at my lawyer, at the judge, herself, saying she had only done what was necessary because Dolores would never let go willingly. The calm strategist became the desperate conspirator, revealing the truth without realizing it. Ryan sat frozen, his pen abandoned. His faith in his mother's story faltered under the weight of his wife's confession. Daniel avoided his gaze, sweat beading at his temples. When recess came, the courthouse swarmed with reporters. Cameras pointed not at me, but at Melissa. Questions flew about conspiracy, about collusion with developers, about family betrayal for profit. She kept walking, face locked, Daniel trailing behind her. Ryan followed, dazed, his role as dutiful accuser shattered. I stepped into the cold air and breathed, steady for the first time in weeks. They had turned my ledgers, my notebooks, even my faith against me. But greed leaves fingerprints that truth can trace. Melissa had revealed what I had known from the beginning. It was never about justice, never about honor. It was about seizing what I had built. That night, I walked through one of my houses on Cortlandt Street. The walls carried the scent of fresh paint. A tenant's child left toys scattered across the floor. This was what they had tried to reduce to bargaining chips. Homes filled with life, not numbers on paper. I ran my hand along the railing I had repaired myself. The wood felt solid, unyielding. The courtroom would return to its process in the morning, but now the tide was irreversible. Melissa's confession had cracked the story wide open, and in the silence of that empty house, I promised myself, they had taken enough of my dignity already. Tomorrow, the reckoning would come. The final day began with a stack of paper taller than a fist and a courtroom too quiet for comfort. The judge returned to the bench and announced that the record would start with the bank officer's supplemental report and the development firm's correspondence that had surfaced after yesterday's admissions. Chairs creaked, pens hovered, and I sat still, palms flat, waiting for the sound of truth to work its way through wood and whispers. The clerk summarized what had arrived overnight, notarized confirmations that the forged loans in my name were tied to shell accounts linked to my son's ventures, email chains from my daughter-in-law to a redevelopment manager, and a spreadsheet mapping every code from my household notebooks to a timeline she had provided to investors. The judge asked for clarity, and Ethan Brooks, measured as always, explained that the bank had completed its trace. The deeds in my name were clean, the debt in my name was not. He pointed to signature anomalies, mismatched correspondence addresses, and transfer paths that flowed everywhere but toward me. The judge turned to the plaintiff's table. She asked Ryan, as the named party, if he wished to proceed in light of the bank's findings. He straightened, searching for legal footing he no longer had. He said he believed the spirit of the case still mattered. He said accountability was owed. He looked at his father for courage and found none. He looked at his wife for certainty and found a contract with a developer staring back at him from Exhibit K. The judge closed her binder and spoke for the room to hear. She found no wrongdoing in the acquisition or management of my 17 properties. She stated that the family's case relied on altered documents, misinterpretation of personal notes, and a theory that collapsed under authenticated records. She dismissed their claim with prejudice and ordered costs against the plaintiffs. Then she said she would forward the forged loan files to the county prosecutor for criminal review. The words were even, not dramatic, but they carried the weight of an anvil. Daniel sagged as if air had been let out of him. Melissa went stone still, a statue with a crack running down the face. Ryan stared at the seal above the bench, his jaw holding steady because it had nothing else to hold. The gallery breathed out all at once. The gavel touched wood, a short sound with the finality of a locked door. But the day did not end there. My attorney rose and asked the court to address the reputational damage that had spilled into the neighborhood and the press. The judge nodded. She invited statements for the record. I stood, not to celebrate, but to set boundaries in the same clear way I once closed a month's books. I said I would continue to manage my properties in my own name. I said those homes had roofs I had paid for and furnaces I had serviced, that they were not chips to be pushed around a development table. I said I had retained an independent auditor to review my records annually, and that the reports would be filed with the court for 3 consecutive years to remove any lingering doubt. I said no family member would hold power of attorney for me now or later. I said that my will would not be a prize. It would be a statement, and it would remain private until the law required otherwise. I kept my voice level. No sermon, no performance, just policy. Then, I turned to the only moral request I would make. I told the judge that I did not seek penalties against my grandson beyond the costs already awarded. I said a young man who carried other people's words like a banner could still learn the language of care. I asked that the record reflect a request that he publish a full retraction addressed to tenants, neighbors, and the local paper, and that he complete pro bono hours at a legal clinic for older adults targeted by family schemes. I said a retraction is not mercy, it is maintenance. The judge looked at me for a long breath and recorded the request as part of the court's recommendation. It was then that the second blow fell, not mine, not the court's, but the law's. A deputy entered with a quiet purpose, handed a paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. She read it, expression flat. The county had issued a warrant based on the bank's referral and the metadata from the development emails. It named Daniel for forgery and identity fraud, with further investigation ongoing into Melissa's role in the transmissions and the attempted property deals. There was no spectacle. The deputy approached my son and asked him to stand. He did, shakily, and allowed himself to be led away, eyes fixed on the floor as if it might rise up and save him. Ryan did not move. Melissa's hands trembled once, then locked at her sides like cold iron. Reporters swarmed the hallway before the courtroom had even emptied. Microphones, questions, flashes, none of it touched me. People parted when I walked, not out of fear, but out of the new knowledge that they had misjudged. In the corridor, Pastor Graham waited, hat in his hands. He apologized without flirt. He said he had taken a mother's help for her son and recast it in a way that served the loudest story. He said he would speak from the pulpit not about forgiveness, but about repair. I nodded. Repair was a language I understood. At the bottom of the steps, Mr. Harlow stood with a folder under his arm and an awkwardness he had never worn before. He said the association had voted to rescind the investigation into my ownership and issue a statement to the local paper correcting their earlier remarks. He said the board would be reviewing its process for handling rumor. He did not call it gossip. He called it negligence. The word fit better. I told him receipts were available if the board ever wanted facts instead of noise. He said they did. In the late afternoon, my phone rang. It was Ryan. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not explain. He said he would make the retraction, not because I asked, but because he had failed at the one job the law gives to those who carry it, to bear proof before carrying judgment. He said he would sign up for the clinic hours. He said he understood now that family grievances are not court exhibits. Documents are not weapons, and mothers are not theories. I told him I would hold him to the actions, not the words. He agreed. The call ended without promises. That was better than apologies. By evening, headlines had flipped. The same hands that had typed suspicion now typed the plain math of it. Deeds clean, loans forged, development deal exposed. Some neighbors left messages on my porch with small notes taped to them: pans of cornbread, jars of soup, awkward attempts at repair. I accepted what was useful and left the rest where it lay. A life is not rebuilt on casseroles, but on systems. The following morning, I sent letters to every tenant, attaching a copy of the court's finding, and a simple paragraph: your lease is secure. Your home is not an entry in someone else's spreadsheet. The person you call when something breaks is still the person who will show up. I printed a notice for the neighborhood board with the same clarity. I did not add adjectives. I did not need them. As for Melissa, the development firm cut ties within hours. Their own counsel leaked a statement that they had been misled by a family representative who claimed authority she did not possess. They would pursue relief if necessary. I did not cheer. The ledger was correcting itself. Numbers do that once you stop pushing them. A week later, the judge called us back for final orders. She granted my request for independent audits to be filed under seal and awarded fees. She recommended the retraction and clinic work to the bar's mentor program reviewing Ryan's conduct as an officer instrument. She reminded the gallery that age does not erase autonomy and that family does not override law. Before she left the bench, she acknowledged that the public had watched this case closely and that the court's language matters. Then she read the list of 17 properties one more time, not to shame me or to inflame the room, but to place the count firmly where it belonged, in the record, upright, unquestioned. When I stepped outside, winter light bounced off the courthouse glass. Reporters waited with new questions about what I would do with the houses now. I told them I would do what I had always done: fix what breaks, pay what's owed, and require that anyone who wants a piece of what I built first show a record of their own. I said my estate plan was not a spectacle. I said I would manage until I could no longer, and then I would appoint someone who had earned the job by work, not by blood. The cameras blinked. That answer did not satisfy the appetite for drama. It satisfied the math. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my manila folders stacked in a neat tower. I wrote instructions for the auditor. I wrote a policy for family access to my records: none without counsel, none without scope, none without time limits. I wrote a letter to myself and slid it under the stack. Remember what silence kept you safe and what silence hurt you. Then I locked the drawer. The lock clicked like a period. I slept for the first time in months, with the window cracked open and the furnace humming steady. Somewhere in the distance, a train threaded its way across the city's seams. Cities are loud, but their backbone is simple: build, fail, repair, repeat. A life works the same way if you let it. I have been asked what I feel now that the court has spoken, now that my son faces charges, now that my grandson has to unlearn what he learned. Feeling is a weather pattern. It passes. What remains are decisions. I decided to keep my name. I decided to keep my keys. I decided that love without brakes is not love. It is a runaway truck headed for whatever stands still. When the court closed and the headlines cooled, I drove to the first house I ever bought. The porch I'd repaired held firm under my weight. I stood there and counted to 17, not as inventory, but as a calendar of stubborn days that added up to shelter for other people. I did not cry. I noted where the paint would need attention come spring. I made a list. And now, as asked, I look back with the calm of someone who has balanced every column in front of witnesses. I walked into a courthouse where my own grandson named me a fraud. And I walked out with every property still in my name because the numbers told the true story when men stopped talking over them. I watched my son choose short roads that looked easy and ended in a ditch. I watched my daughter-in-law treat homes as chips and my notebooks as code. And I watched a banker and an old colleague hand the room a mirror. The lesson is not pretty, but it is useful. Kinship is not a credential. Signatures are not affection. And a good name must be maintained like a roof: checked, reinforced, inspected by someone who isn't sleeping under it. If you are between 45 and 65, if you are holding up 2 generations and forgetting to hold your own line, hear me clearly. Do not guarantee what you cannot control. Do not cosign your way into silence. And do not let family manage your records in your house without a witness who isn't paid by love. I learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are the only proof you have that you understand cost. I learned that when accusation comes, you do not outshout it. You outlast it with receipts and process. And I learned that repair is a daily chore. The people who hurt you may never say the words you think you need, but they can still repair publicly measurably if you set the work in front of them. 2. Those watching who have been dressed in the wrong story by people with your last name, take this from me. You do not have to burn down a house to reclaim it. You change the locks, you post the rules, you hire the inspector. You learn the words you will insist on hearing before anyone moves in again. If your faith has been used against you, ask for repair, not theater. If your memory has been twisted, bring paper. If your love has been weaponized, put it back behind glass where it belongs until the room is safe. If this helped you stand a little straighter in your own kitchen tonight, stay with me for the next story. I will keep speaking plainly. Subscribe if you want to walk the rest of the road with me.